Hi, Susan.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Susan Gelman, a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan and also the author of probably more than one book, but the one we're going to focus on is The Essential Child, Origins of Essentialism and Everyday Thought, published by Oxford University Press. We're going to talk about essentialism, which is a human tendency that I would say can have good consequences and bad consequences, including very bad ones, I think, potentially. And it's a tendency we all have, but we tend not to be aware of precisely because we have it. It's just part of our way of looking at the world, and we kind of take it for granted. But psychologists like you have kind of teased out some of its features in recent years, so we're getting a clearer grasp of it. Do you want to start by telling us what, like, if you're at a cocktail party and somebody hears about this book and they say, well, what is essentialism? What do you say?
So, one example I like to use from popular culture and kind of gives a sense of what it is how a lot of people think about transgender individuals, like Caitlyn Jenner. So here you have someone who identifies as female, has a female name, looks female, dresses female, and lives every aspect of her life as female. But if you go online and you see what people say when there are news reports about things she's been doing, people will argue with great passion that not only is this person male, but was always male, will always be male, and there's no way to kind of take the maleness out of a person and transform them to being female. And so I think what this is exemplifying is the idea that the categories that we use to kind of organize our experience are not just things that we do, but they have a real basis in reality. And once you know the category that something belongs to, it's telling you something very deep about what that thing is or what that person is.
So we feel as if there's this kind of intangible but real essence within this thing, and you can do all kinds of, superficial manipulations, but there's no way of changing the essence of the thing.
Right, absolutely. It's this immutable underlying reality. And, if you apply something like essentialism to, say, biological categories of cats and dogs, it may not be exactly biologically accurate, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because it kind of motivates us to look beyond surface features and understand the world in a deeper way. Mm-hmm. But when you apply these concepts to social categories like gender or race or the caste system in India and so forth, then it can have these pernicious consequences.
Mm-hmm. It's almost inherently a form of stereotyping in a way. It's certainly a form of generalizing, right? Of saying all these different animals that are different colors and so on, they're all cats. And so on, and that, as you say, it has plenty of benign uses. It's an efficient way to organize the world. Presumably that has something to do with the fact that we naturally do it, right? I mean,
right.
In a certain sense, it's hard to imagine living without it.
Well, let me also be clear, though. Essentialism involves categories, but not all categories require essentialism.
Right.
You could have a category of, I'm going to put all the blue objects, in my house in one corner of a room, say. Mm-hmm. That's a category. That's like taking one set of things, applying a rule, and, making a behavior on the basis of that rule. But you're not thinking by doing so that they have any deep, rich reality to them.
If you painted one red, you'd go, okay, that's a red thing now.
Exactly, right. It can shift from one to the other. There's nothing special about its insides. But with essentialism, there's this belief that, there are the superficial similarities. They're tied to deeper similarities. And underneath all of that, there's some core causal something that makes something what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Often it's just like a placeholder. We don't even know what that something is. We just have a belief that there's some sort of essence.
Mm-hmm. Now, experiments have been done with children, right, where they run them through a whole bunch of kind of surface manipulations. There's like one with different animals, and they take a squirrel, or there's a pretty famous one. Where so how does that one go?
Yeah, that's Frank Kyle's study, where he would show kids, for example, a raccoon, and you'd say, "What is this?" Kids would say, "It's a raccoon." Great. And then they go through these superficial transformations of shaving off some of its fur and painting it and putting a smelly sack in it and so on. And then you present kids with what looks like a skunk. And it behaves a skunk. And you say to kids, well, what is this? And at a fairly early age, kids will say, it's a raccoon. And you say, well, what? It looks like a skunk. Oh, can't possibly be a skunk. It started as a raccoon. It's still a raccoon.
Right.
That's one kind of method that's been used to find essentialism in kids. But there have been a host of other measures as well.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, as we said, it's an efficient way of dealing with the world. And of course, the human brain started taking shape before we were as smart as humans are. And so I guess this it's built pretty deeply into us. I mean, I'm sure my dog is an essentialist, right? Don't you think?
Well, the jury is still out on that one. There's some really interesting research with non-human primates suggesting that maybe they're essentialists, that they know that surface appearances aren't everything. I'm sure your dog is a very sophisticated categorizer.
Thank you.
The question, as are my two cats, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they think that category boundaries are rigid, that you can't shift from one category to another, that insides matter, and there are a couple of things that we humans do with language that other species don't have access to, that I really think at the very least strengthen our essentialist tendencies, but may even kind of reify them in a way that non-human animals without language can't do.
Yes. So specific features of human language?
Well, I can tell you two in particular. So one is labels. When we give something a label, we are communicating what it is in a very deep sense that can completely contradict how you might otherwise categorize it. So, there are so many cases in the biological world where due to camouflage or sexual dimorphism or developmental change, something might look like one thing but really be something else. Like a leaf insect really looks like a leaf. Mm-hmm. But all I have to do is tell you, it's an insect. And that will instantly shift how you think of it and the inferences that you make. Biologists could do very in-depth analyses to figure out precisely that, this thing that looks like a bee is actually a type of fly, or this lizard that looks just like a snake isn't a snake, and all of that. And that, you don't have to be the brilliant scientist in order to appreciate that. All you have to do is be a young child listening to the words that are used to label things. So it's this incredible, powerful device we have.
Right. And in that case, on the one hand, you could say that shows that we are not bound to essences. We can recategorize things. On the other hand, when you look at what's going on psychologically in people, they're kind of transferring one kind of essentialism to another, right? Like if there's this person I think is a great guy, and somebody says, no, he's not a great guy, he's a con man. You're not aware of his criminal record. It's like there's a whole set of associations I did have with him, and now I have a different set, but it's very kind of deeply felt.
Well, exactly. And that's my point, that these labels imply, they convey here we have a category about which you can make deep inferences when you give a label to something, as opposed to like just looking at the thing or describing the thing. The label is like, this is what it is, in a real essentialist way. The other thing that people do with language that no other species does is we can talk about categories as a whole, and we do it all the time in language that feels very kind of easy and informal, which is we'll talk about things like dogs as a category or birds as a category. We'll say things like birds fly. Well, actually, not all birds fly, but we treat birds as a category as if they have this property. And it's a way of kind of, generalizing over experience. And it turns out, I mean, some research that I have done and other people have done, when you use these generalizations with young kids, they essentialize categories that they hear described in these terms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I saw on, I think your website or some website, you are something of a supporter of what's sometimes called the modular view of the mind, or the domain specific, the idea that the human mind consists of a number of kind of different mechanisms that, probably didn't evolve at exactly the same time and are somewhat specialized in what they do. And of course they interact. It's an integrated system, but there is kind of division of labor within the mind. Is that right, first of all?
Well, I will say, I think I'm often associated with that position in part because I co-edited a book with Larry Hirschfeld where it was an edited volume where we brought together a number of different researchers talking about domain specificity in human cognition and how to account for that. And I'm very sympathetic to domain-specific views of certain aspects of cognition. But I think my thinking has changed over the years as well. And I don't think of essentialism as being linked to any one particular domain.
Well, that's what I was going to kind of ask you. I would think that although essentialism in general might be a kind of tendency that from natural selection's point of view is useful in a lot of different ways, that we might have different essence-making machinery for different things. I mean, for example, during human evolution, humans were in a very special category, right? I mean, you interacted with them socially. They could be your friends. They could be your enemies. You could reproduce in conjunction with them. I mean, and there's all kinds of reasons to think that we have a bunch of specialized machinery for dealing with them. Animals are kind of have their own things. There's plants. There's inanimate objects. So you might think that there's not going to be a grand unified theory of essence making, except to the extent that there's essence making in all of these domains. But aside from that we have specialized, kind of subcategories of essence, specialized, taxonomies of kinds of things within a given domain, if that makes sense.
Well, I do think the way we kind of organize experience, across different cultures, there are certain commonalities and certain ways that we treat different domains in distinct manners. But I think this tendency to look beyond the surface appearances and expect kind of a hidden layer to the world, as you pointed out, you can see this in how we think about other humans and, competing coalitions. That's very much kind of based on categories. We see it with how we reason about the natural world and like different kinds of animals and so on. But in some ways, we even see this in how we think about artifacts. So, and here I'm going to be kind of channeling Paul Bloom, who's talked a lot about this, but objects at least for, let's say, in the US, I guess there's somewhat of an open question how broad this is, but we think of objects as kind of carrying traces of their history. So the Mona Lisa has a special quality that, an exact reproduction could never capture. So there's a sense in which, individual objects could be thought to have some sort of essence, if you will. Mm-hmm. Not quite in the same sense as, a raccoon has a raccoon essence, but there's certainly very analogous reasoning going on there.
Yeah, Paul Bloom made some of these arguments, I think, in the course of writing his book on pleasure.
Exactly.
And so one of the, he was saying that, and I talked to him about this actually in one of these conversations, and he was saying that even something like food has a story behind it. Like if it's prepared by a friend as opposed to you're buying at a restaurant, that affects kind of your feeling about it. So yeah, that there's a narrative, there's kind of an assumed history or a story behind things that shapes your sense of their essence.
Yes.
Now the reason I ask about the differences between kind of artifacts and humans is like with humans, I mean, there are a bunch of domains where we go, no, bad, stay away, like dangerous animals, poisonous plants, people we define as bad. But with people, there are more subtle things we do, like if it's an enemy or something, there are additional kind of tendencies of appraisal that evokes that it might not in a plant, or that it would be nonsensical for it to evoke in a plant. For example, you can't trust that person, they're going to lie, they're a bad person. Or if they do something good, they just did that to under peer pressure or something, because not a good person. If they do something bad, that's essence of them coming out. They're bad people. So it seems like there's a whole set of specialized mechanisms that we apply in the realm of humans associated with essence that maybe help some of the bad consequences we were talking about earlier transpire. And maybe sometimes good consequences. Maybe they make you appropriately wary of generally bad people. That can happen. But it can also be part of the demonization that leads to group conflicts spiraling out of control and so on.
Right. No, I think that's a really great point. One question I've been puzzling with recently is how essentialism of, evil, if you will, or just criminality ties into our feelings about punishment. Because you might think, on the one hand, that if somebody is in some essential way bad, that it's kind of out of their control. It's just the way they were born, and you should have compassion for them because they're not necessarily responsible for it. But on the other hand, I think there's some evidence out there that it's, if anything, perhaps a reverse, that we're particularly kind of horrified by and want to punish those who we see as intrinsically bad. Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's maybe an inconsistency in our moral reasoning in this domain. But
yeah, and there's like essence of bad. I mean, when you think somebody's in a way, the word evil is used as a way to get people to feel essence of bad. It's a label that it's essence of ultimate bad.
Right.
Like incorrigibly bad.
Incorrigible. Right.
You just have to kill them.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I guess there are various, come to think of it, dimensions of essential evaluation when we deal with humans. So there's good and bad for sure, but there's also, like brilliant, genius, and there's and there's like Donald Trump right now. I'm trying to figure this out, because
you and a lot of people.
Because leave the politics aside, the thing that has most astounded me is I thought there was kind of like a national consensus on what constituted a jerk. Like I thought basically nobody likes somebody who just brags in these really egregious ways. But okay, so obviously I was wrong about that, and I'm thinking maybe what's dominating the perception among his fans is kind of essence of success, essence of, right? I mean, this guy knows how to do things. I mean, that's a huge theme of his, and like, that's so important.
Yeah. And it's really, it's sort of inherently in him, no matter what he does, is kind of the rhetoric. Right. It's not really, don't judge him based on his actions, really, but just on his kind of inherent worth.
Yeah. And if he okay, so he's flip-flopped some on the issues, but the main thing is whatever he does will be a success. I don't know.
Can I pick up on you use the phrase innate brilliance, I think. Yeah. And there is this really interesting finding that came out last year. Andre Simpian and Sarah Jane Leslie and their colleagues, where they looked at fields in academia that are either more or less gender imbalanced. Mm-hmm. So there are some fields like physics, which are very heavily male. Then there are other fields like psychology, which are more 50-50. And they found that the more the practitioners in those fields believed in kind of an essentialist, innate brilliance as required for success in that field, the more male-dominated the field was. And so, they're arguing that certain kinds of beliefs and biases about these fields influence judgments that get made about what's required for success, and then ultimately has trickle-down effects for who goes into those fields. So that to me, I thought was a really fascinating way where, we talked about essence of evil, but essence of good can have these consequences as well.
Right. And in that case, it was just like essence of competence, essence of skill, kind of.
Well, except they don't even talk about it as skill. It's really this kind of...
It's just genius.
Brilliance, genius. Yeah, this cult of genius.
And is the idea that presumption inherently favors males because there's this bias in the way people perceive males?
Yes, that's my understanding of the argument.
Okay, so that's another thing Donald Trump has going for. So I'm curious, has much work been done on, I mean, as you said, essence is different from just categorizing things, which is in a way a purely just kind of cognitive, analytical enterprise. When it comes to essence, has much work been done on the role that affect plays in assigning essence to things? And we should say by affect, a psychologist means kind of, feeling good or bad feelings, for example, with emotions, although not only in the kind of most famous emotions. I mean, any positive or negative feeling you assign to something is affect. Has work been done on that?
That's a really interesting question, and I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it, and you can tell me if it fits in with your question or not. Essentialism can be used in really motivated ways. So, for example, one study that I thought was really fascinating on this was done by one of my colleagues, Ram Mahalingam, was looking at the caste system in India, and he found that upper caste individuals were much more essentialist about caste than lower caste individuals. So if you were a Brahmin, then you thought that, being a member of this caste is inborn, it can't be changed, it's immutable, it kind of pervades you through and through, and, even if you're raised by a member of a lower caste, you'll still within yourself be Brahmin. Whereas the members of the lower castes rejected essentialism, and they said, no, this is a social construction. It's not in the individual. It's kind of this artificial system that's imposed. So it may, I don't know if that's exactly emotions, but it certainly motivated cognition that is influencing whether or not you adopt an essentialist perspective.
And I'm just, for one thing, thinking about doing the same experiment in America. We don't have caste per se, but I'm wondering if there are similar beliefs. I guess you might, beliefs about innate potential or something, but that kind of get at that. But maybe it's not the same. Well, I'm also thinking about inanimate things like like Paul Bloom. I'm not thinking about things. In that book he talks about. I think he starts the book with this anecdote in which I forget. Maybe it was Hermann Goering, some Nazi war criminal who had been duped by buying what he thought was a genuine Vermeer painting, and then it came out like during his trial or something that it was a forgery or something like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Somebody describes the look that came over him, and it's just clear that something affective was going on, not just the horror at having been duped, but the kinds of, kind of feeling you have about a proud possession. I mean, Paul also talks about somebody paid, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars for John Kennedy's golf clubs. And if you imagine, like, they're gazing on those golf clubs, if somebody walked up and said, wait, there's been a mistake. Those are not Kennedy's golf clubs. We just got those from a discount sporting goods.
There'd be like a physiological reaction to that.
And it would be affective, right?
Right. We find this even with young kids. So we have shown them like two identical flag pins, and we say, you know what? This one was owned by President Obama. This one was owned by the experimenter's dad. And we ask them to estimate how much each one is worth. And the one owned, by the way, kids are not very good with monetary estimates, but for the kind of everyday one owned by the experimenter's dad, on average, they said it was worth $98. The one owned by Obama, on average, they said was worth $62,000. So, I mean, that's coming in quite early, this sense of value. And I don't know if anyone's looked at this, but I would think things like, if you had physiological measures of kind of, whether the person's pulse is racing and how much they wanted to approach the object, I think these would be affected by these sorts of beliefs at quite an early age.
And in general, I gather in your book you document how early people are essentialists.
And it's very early. Yeah.
Are there other experiments that are particularly illustrative?
One that we have used a lot is posing these sorts of nurture versus nature conflicts for kids. So, like, we'll tell them about, say, a baby kangaroo that's the minute it's born, it's taken to live with a family of goats, and they raise it from birth. And when it gets older, will it be good at hopping or good at climbing? And they will consistently say that it has the properties consistent with its birth parents, and those are going to emerge no matter what. It has this innate potential. And then what's interesting too, I mean, adults also think that animals have innate potential, but one developmental difference that I think is really interesting is that young kids kind of overextend it. So they think that, like 5-year-olds, think that language is determined by the birth parents and not the parents who raised the child, which obviously, adults don't believe. And they think that gender-linked properties are innately determined and are unaffected by environment. So, a boy who's raised completely only with females will still want to play football, be, good at sports and all of the rest of that. So they seem to hold to this very kind of essentialist perspective that they overextend.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, some of these things are modified as they grow up, particularly in the case of language. They realize that, language is absorbed from your environment. But in general, what did you come away from the experience of writing the book with in terms of your views on, like, whether parents can much hope to change essentialist tendencies in their kids, whether they should, whether even if they, whether they can or not, whether it's a worthwhile goal to change essentialist tendencies. I know it's not like a Dr. Spock child rearing book, but if parents ask you where if anywhere should I try to intervene, what do you say?
Well, so on the one hand, now, people have been, including myself, have been looking at essentialism for 30 years now and have been interested in kind of how broad it is. And people have gone all over the world and used, the different kinds of measures that are out there and find essentialism in all these different cultural contexts. So it seems to be a very kind of natural, easy way to think, and we find it in kids and we find it in adults, and it's very widespread. On the other hand, there are these fairly striking variations as well, particularly about social categories. So, every culture that's been studied, you see essentialism about the animal world emerging early and consistently. But with the social world, it can be really varied. And so, that actually gives me a lot of hope, because that says that kids are responsive to what their environment is telling them. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite studies of this was done by a former student of mine, Marjorie Rhodes, where she looked at two communities in Michigan that were like practically next to each other. They were only an hour apart. So in a broad sense, they're from the same, kind of cultural community, but one was more conservative, one was more liberal, one was less diverse, one was more diverse. And there are, various kind of minor differences as you see across communities in the U.S. And what she found was essentialism of animals was high for both communities. Essentialism of artifacts as measured by, this wasn't looking at like authentic works of art kind of objects, but just like ordinary objects, was low. Gender started out high, dropped in the liberal community, and stayed high over age in the conservative community. Race started out low in both communities, stayed low in the liberal community, and increased in the conservative community. So you got completely different patterns suggesting that there's something about the messages these kids are getting, which either, fosters essentialism or has it drop, and in very category-specific ways.
Yeah, what I had heard anecdotally, and to some extent, I guess, observed, is that as far as race goes, kids at a very young age mingle across racial lines very easily and are almost not aware of ethnicity in a certain sense. They are, but it's just not a big deal.
Exactly.
And then things get complicated at adolescence. Now, it sounds like in one of these communities, in different communities, things might get complicated to different extents, but that's the kind of anecdotal thing I'd heard. It sounds like broadly consistent. And it's interesting because it's a case where, we had talked about essentialism being like showing up really early. This is a case where the essentialism tends to surface later.
It does, although it also it emerges at different times depending on the child's own racial identity. So there are a few studies now showing that like white kids in the U.S. in these studies tend not to essentialize race until about 9 or 10, whereas African American kids are much more aware of race at an earlier age. So at 5 to 6, they're behaving similarly to the 9 to 10-year-old white kids. They have an earlier kind of developmental trajectory when it comes to thinking about race.
I would think in general minority ethnicities become aware earlier or more acutely or something, because it in a certain sense matters more to them. If you're the majority ethnicity, it's just kind of not a problem in the typical social circumstance.
Yeah.
The so I'm wondering, are you at all conversant in Buddhist philosophy?
No, I'm not.
Well, this is.
Tell me the link.
Buddhist philosophy is very anti-essentialist.
Oh, neat.
In fact, I would say that there are the two main kind of experiential apprehensions that one has on the path to enlightenment and the two most radical claims that are made are, first of all, that the self doesn't exist. That's pretty well known. That Buddhists make the claim. The other one is what often goes under the term of emptiness. It's an apprehension about the world out there. The term is sunyata, typically translated as emptiness, although there's always controversy about translations. But it's the way it's sometimes put is that things have no essence. These objects have no essence. And in fact, sometimes the same term is used that refers to not self in the person is applied to the object, so it becomes a universal doctrine that nothing has self. That I don't have essence, things don't have essence. I don't have a self, things don't have a self. And in fact, the three marks of existence that are said to characterize everything in Buddhism are dukkha, or suffering, impermanence, and not self. And that's not just people. So it's a very anti-essentialist thing, and the reason I ask about affect is I kind of have a theory that the experiential apprehension of emptiness or seeing things as not having essence may have something to do with a less strong affective reaction to things, which in general can be a product of meditation. But it's absolutely an anti-essentialist philosophy, and there's and along with that, well, actually, here we get into matters of interpretation. But some people would say there's a sense of unity, and some people would say that's actually not the Buddhist view; it's more of a Hindu view or whatever. But the idea is that the distinctions among things tend to break down as you see them as projecting their essential identities less strongly.
Well, I think it could be very illuminating for someone interested in essentialism to look at how kids kind of take this in when they're being instructed in Buddhist philosophy and teachings, and kind of how they interpret it and what sorts of struggles they might have.
I mean, I guess it's not surprising that enlightenment is such an elusive thing if it involves letting go of the intuition of essentialism, right? I mean, you would say that's built into us pretty deeply.
Yes.
So another place where you hear essentialism is in kind of I don't know if it's a social science context, but like there are different views of religions, for example, right? I mean, you see this in the discussion of terrorism, and people say, is Islam a religion of peace, or is it not? And my view has always been there's no such thing as a religion of either war or peace, because there's so many manifestations of religion, but of any given religion.
Right. And, to what extent do you see religion as a belief system or an ethnicity or an identity? How much do you think that this is something that someone is kind of born into and that's kind of set for life? I read a book a few years ago that was written by Janet McIntosh, who's a linguistic anthropologist, where she was looking at beliefs about religion and the cultural group that she was studying, and they had this kind of overt belief that anyone could convert to Islam. But when you actually questioned people about it, they felt that it was not something that anyone could really adopt at will. And so they would say, well, that person doesn't have the right blood, So they're not really a member of that religious group. And so it was a real, like a contrast between the kind of what was supposed to be the manner in which people could enter or exit into different social groups, and this, kind of core essentialist belief that just said, you are what you are, and that's it.
I see. Yeah. So, I was kind of thinking of it more at the group level, like, is there an essence of the religion, but it's related to the question of what constitutes...
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Is there... well, yeah, you see. But they're related, they're kind of related questions. Presumably the individual member of the religion would partake... of the properties you're assigning to the religion generally. In a way, one reason it matters whether you're an essentialist about religions is because then, if you are, then you're going to attribute to the individual every, the properties you're attributing to the religion as a whole.
Right. My sense is, I would guess, not that I really know this area at all, but I would not be surprised if people assume, for example, that a religion is pretty static over time, and that that they would expect that if you went back 500 years, it would be the same as it is now, and if you go forward 500 years, it's going to be the same still, and have trouble kind of appreciating the historical changes and how contingent it all is, really.
Right.
And so that would be very consistent with this idea that you're suggesting.
And it'd be interesting to see whether people are more likely to attribute essence to religions other than their own. It seems like any American Christian should be aware that there's nothing that all American Christians have in common, like ethically, in terms of the way they behave. There's no... we all purport to like love and stuff, all of us, but in terms of any given specific ethical question, right?
Right.
We all know you can't generalize about Christians.
Right.
And I wonder if people attribute more in the way of essence to, I don't know, it's a complicated question. Religions differ in how variegated they are, probably. Anyway, final stop on our whirlwind tour of ways to apply essentialism. There's a whole philosophical issue, right, going back to Plato, about essence. Is that you want to talk a little about that, and about
Sure.
whether you see that as a manifestation of just intuitive essentialism?
Sure.
What
sure.
Plato's view was, and so on.
Yeah. So Plato, I think of Plato's sense of essence as a little bit different from, there's a big difference, and then there's another difference. So two that I wanted to just touch on. One is, of course, Plato was making claims about the nature of the universe, and I'm not trying to answer that question. I'm just trying to understand how people think. What are human representations like? And that's why we call it psychological essentialism. And it's a point that may seem obvious, but it's always one that I have to emphasize, because sometimes I think when people are talking about human belief systems, it's easy for someone to think that it's a claim about how the world really is. So that's one difference between psychological essentialism and any philosophical view on essentialism. But then within, kind of apart from that, Plato kind of, at my understanding, I was a Greek major in college, so I actually read Plato, but he thought of the essence as something that was never fully realized in the world in which we live. It was this idealized kind of, the Platonic form is like this, the real world never has the perfect triangle or the perfect table or anything like that. That's purely at the level of like...
Yeah, is this where his cave metaphor comes in?
Yes.
So we are it's as if we were in a cave, and the real illumination is on the outside, and all we're seeing is like shadows on the wall. But
exactly.
It's the real world of forms out there whose whose kind of distant or oblique manifestation we're seeing, and our world is not the real world. The real world is the world of forms.
Exactly. So that's like the essence as this ideal. And I think with psychological essentialism, people aren't thinking about it that way. They're thinking that the essence is actually embodied inherently within each individual member of the category. So you carry within yourself inherent humanness, inherent maleness, or whatever category we're thinking about. And that, I think, is really kind of different from Plato's view.
Yeah. Although I could kind of see him, like, getting this sense, like, okay, he gets a sense about this woman, its essence of female, and this one. There's like something they all have in common, and he's going, but they're different, but there's something deep and fundamental there, and it's deep, right? I mean, essence feels deep. And so you can kind of see how he'd go. So there's this. It's
a related concept. Yeah. I just don't think it's exactly.
I mean, you could also see him, and I'm sure people characterize him this way, as kind of getting misled by language, investing too much stock in the way we use language. So it's a single word. Woman is a single word, and man is a single word. And if you assume that language has a correspondence to reality, well, there you go. There somewhere, there must be some, these that you can then see individual men as emanations of this more fundamental thing called man. So there's that way of looking at it, I guess. But it wouldn't surprise me if he got a little bit of an assist from, an intuitive essentialism.
Yeah.
But in any event, in a way, is his view kind of the opposite of yours? In other words, he thought the real world is the world of form. So there's a real single chair that embodies chairness perfectly, and then all these kind of individual chairs are not the real thing. Do you view it almost like the opposite? Like, look, the world is just different people and different things, and in the course of imposing order on it for practical purposes, we come to feel as if, or we have been designed to feel as if, by natural selection maybe, but whatever, we feel as if there's an underlying unity, but that's the not real part?
Well, okay, so now you're asking me to
become
state
a philosopher,
claims about
Tell me what's real. Before we go, could you just tell me what's real and what's not real, please?
It's the thing is that, this is going to maybe take essentialism beyond what it can really support, psychological essentialism beyond what it can support. But we do see this like kind of crack between the intuitive way we think about categories and what we do know from what biologists have discovered about, epigenetics and variety within a species and interbreeding populations and all of that. So you can see that divide between the human intuitive representation and what science tells us about those items that we're categorizing. And so that does suggest, it kind of gives you illumination on human bias and ways in which we don't have this like truthful representation of reality. So it almost forces me into drawing some conclusions about the nature of reality, even though I would not like to say that I really am in a position to do so.
Well, I don't know. You've got tenure. You can say anything you want, right? I guess maybe final question. So do you ever find yourself like fighting your tendency to essentialize?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I start my book with admitting the very shameful truth that I remember being an essentialist as a child. I've seen it in my own children. I have to fight it quite a bit. And I think I would like to think that I have a different perspective on the world now than before I started doing this research. But it's, it's hard to really stamp it out completely.
But I assume you find it selectively. I mean, it's like if you, walk by a bunch of refrigerators and you get essence of refrigerator from them, no great harm in that, right? Is it more? It's more in the human realm, the realm of judging human beings.
Yeah, and exactly. Do you know Carol Dweck's work on different mindsets?
I don't.
Okay, she talks about how we think about intelligence, and we can think about it as this kind of thing that's sitting within us. You either have it or you don't. Like it's back to the innate brilliance thing. So either like you have this high IQ or you don't kind of thing. There's nothing you can do to shift your basic capacity. Or you could think of it as, there are many skills that one can develop. You can work to have a deeper understanding of the world. If you put in the time and the effort, you can move to more sophisticated levels of understanding. And that's an area where, a lot of people start with this kind of fixed mindset, which is really a kind of essentialism about intelligence. Mm-hmm. And her work has shown how it's very undermining in certain ways. Like if you hit a roadblock and you have the idea that either you're smart or not, then a mm-hmm. roadblock is very demotivating because you take it as evidence that, you're no good, there's no point trying. But if you have more of a growth mindset, and environment is important and your effort is important, then if you hit an obstacle, you take that as reason to kind of reapply yourself with even more effort. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one that our educational system sometimes maybe unwittingly kind of pushes more the essentialist perspective. So I think a lot of us have had many years of kind of being steeped in that way of thinking about our own our own educational success.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Susan. The book, again, is The Essential Child. People want to pick that up and learn more about essence and maybe become more aware of their own essentialist tendencies. So thanks for taking the time, and maybe we'll talk again down the road.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.